And you are live.
Welcome to House Education, final day of January, 2025. We have a number of items on the agenda for today. This morning will be in our final moments in this committee room, and then this afternoon we're over at the Pavilion. We're going to start it off just talking about a topic that continues to come up as we discuss education transformation and the scale that we're in all the time. Anyway, I'm turn it over to Chelsea Meyer from the Superintendent's Association to give us a little more insight on this. It's all yours.
Yeah, hi everyone. Chelsea Myers, Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendent's Association. In a second, I have Superintendent Bill Kimball on with me as well to illuminate some of the more practical elements of the research that I'll kind of go over and cover today, because ultimately anything that is put into place needs to be implemented, and he has a lot of experience in that realm. What motivated me to kind of look deeper into the research on scale is the considerations in the governor's proposal with a pretty large consolidation effort around 5 school districts. And what struck me is that it was based around the Vermont Superintendent's Association regions, which we know are not necessarily grounded in anything. They were just formed as a reason to bring together superintendents. And so that spurred me to want to look at, well, what does the research really say about district size? We've already been having conversations about class size very regularly with superintendents for the last 2 years and what that looks like. And I also threw in some of the research about school size as well, though that one's a little bit more mixed. But with that, I'll ask Bill to introduce himself and a little bit of his background.
Thank you, Chelsea. Can everyone hear me fine?
Sounds good, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Collin. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bill Kimball. I'm the Superintendent of Schools for the Maple Run School District. Before I give a little bit, I'd just like to give a little bit of my past for those who don't know me. I've been here at Maple Run for the past 6 years, but prior to that, I was in the Washington Central Unified Union School District right before it merged as a superintendent for 7 years. And prior to that, I was a central office administrator and teacher for approximately 20 years. Let's just say that without counting back. I wanted to really say that my experience has been working with communities and school boards on instructional sizes throughout, not just my superintendency, but when I was a curriculum director as well in Orleans Southwest. And it really, the structure of schools and districts really impacts the class size and really the instructional delivery that students receive. I have experience working in elementary schools as small as 60 kids and supporting them, and then up to the existing pre-K 8 schools that we have here in Maple Run of 700, 750, and our high school of 900. And those instructional sizes for schools and for classes impacts how we can serve kids the most. So I know that we'll be talking about that during today. So I just wanted to kind of give you that background, as well as my doctoral studies is examining the intersection of superintendents and communities in rural northern New England, and how that impacts what we can do to improve our schools for our children. So I'll leave it there, Chelsea.
All right. So I put together some slides since I realized that a 5-page document is pretty dense. I will say the kind of substance is in that paper and less so on the slides, but I'm going to try to cover it in depth anyways. So the size and scale of educational structures, class size, student-teacher ratios, administrative capacity, school district size, and school size are often considered influential factors in shaping the quality of instruction and overall student outcomes. However, research on their direct impact remains mixed. Their effectiveness is deeply intertwined with factors such as teacher quality, that's a big one, resource availability, and the unique needs of local communities. In rural areas, for example, geographic necessity adds another layer of complexity as sparsely populated regions often face challenges such as small enrollments, long transportation distances, and limited access to specialized staff or resources. Balancing educational quality with efficiency and affordability requires careful consideration of research and contextual factors. This brief explores how instructional scale can be considered to address these intersecting priorities using research and practical input from Vermont superintendents. Policy decisions in the 2025 legislative session should balance quality and efficiency. They must be able to be implemented with fidelity. The recommendations in this brief offer a sensible step related to instructional scale towards those core principles, while Vermont invests time and resources in a long-term achievable vision. And what we're trying to say there is that this might not necessarily be an end state, but we feel like it is a potentially good starting place in terms of an achievable first step in when we look at efficiency and move towards quality while maintaining quality. So we'll talk a little bit about district size and governance, school size, class size, and then wrap it up. We just talked about the intro, so I won't go into that more detail. Research on school district size suggests a very complex and underexplored relationship. So there is research out there. There's not a whole lot of research, but there are some general trends from the research that does exist. Overall, district consolidation alone is not a complete solution. It should be paired with additional measures to enhance quality and efficiency. Research on district size paints a picture of a U shape around efficiency. So very, very small, not super efficient. There's like a mid-range that are quite efficient. And then once you hit a certain limit, it becomes less efficient, more bureaucratic. It requires more transportation needs. According to Vermont, studies indicate that smaller districts typically face higher per pupil costs due to inefficiencies. And according to Vermont Education Profile Report, supervisory districts or unions with less than 1,050 long-term average daily membership spent 26,000, and those with greater than 2,000 spent 21,000. Please note that this does not consider weights or equalization, which is a strong policy choice in Vermont, so we should certainly compare it that way. However, very large districts may encounter diseconomies of scale, where the benefits of increased size are outweighed. A research study found that consolidating small districts can reduce per pupil costs, and the research suggests that the most significant cost savings comes from when very small districts merge rather than really large districts merging.
Chelsea, if I could just interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
And ask, when we use the term consolidation,
Yeah.
are we talking about strictly governance, or are we also talking about physical buildings?
Yeah, so that's an important point to point out. Researchers suggest that there's not a whole lot of really solid research around the interaction between school building size and district size. So they haven't done a good job of kind of marrying the research between school building size and district size. So this particular research is just talking about district size rather than the actual school size of the buildings in there.
Or number of buildings.
Or number of buildings, correct. So an additional study looked at economies of size and suggests that the optimal district size for minimizing costs per pupil while maintaining educational quality appears to be in the 2,000 to 4,000 student range. They also find that diseconomies of scale may begin at about 15,000 students. And another study in Kansas, which is a more rural population, found that the diseconomies might start to emerge around 10,000 students. It's important to note that while consolidation may lead to cost savings in some cases, it's not guaranteed. The Education Commission of the States in 2024 highlighted that transition costs, such as those for new facilities, transportation, and integration, can offset potential savings. Additionally, the impact of educational quality must be carefully considered alongside potential cost efficiencies when evaluating district size changes. The Vermont Adequacy Study, or otherwise known as the PICUS report, cites a prototypical district size of 30,900, determined by grouping 8 schools, 4 elementary, 2 middle, and 2 high schools, at their stated ideal school size. So PICUS is actually creating a district model based on ideal school size rather than necessarily around district size. as far as I can tell from the report. The study also contrasts its prototypical district size with national averages, which sits around 3,713 students in the fall of 2016 is the date that they cited. As we learned through the implementation of Act 46, district consolidation is very politically complex and logistically complex. You all have been highlighting a lot of those complexities and how significant law changes would need to be to consolidate, particularly around redistricting. Vermont school districts currently have different operating configurations related to the grade levels they do or do not operate, leading to Vermont's out-of-district tuition program. These configurations lead to greater complexity, less fiscal controls, and increased ancillary needs, such as transportation and delivery of special services. I do want to point out that I hear from a superintendent that works for a district that is completely non-operating. So they have no schools, they just tuition, and they are having a tremendous time trying to sell their budget to their community because they've reached the excess spending penalty, but have no way to make any controls over the fiscal environment because every single one of their students is tuitioned. So that's just an example of the less fiscal controls element. The Education Funding System Explained report describes some supervisory unions have more than one school board, which is a very rare structure elsewhere in the country. Some supervisory unions can have between 2 to 7 school boards, depending on the number of school districts in their region, with between 10 and 78 total school board members. On average, supervisory unions have 1 board member for approximately every 75 students. Though school board members are effectively volunteers, this large and multifaceted governance structure often requires significant administrative time and resources to support, including multiple board meetings a month per central office staff and considerable resources to support budgeting across multiple school districts. Time and resources that could be allocated to instructional leadership and other functions to support education quality. As a comparison, according to the New Hampshire School Boards Association, New Hampshire has approximately 900 school board members serving about 165,000 students. Vermont has a similar number of school board members and about half the students. Data from the U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics reveals that administrative expenses account for about 6.7% of school districts' budgets nationwide, a slight increase from 6.6 2 decades earlier. Recommendations related to school district size should help Vermont realize economies of scale in central offices, allowing for greater efficiencies in role specialization. Increases in federal and state regulations and reporting requirements directly impact the administration's role. Defining these functions for central office could inform effective and efficient staffing models. And just to add a little commentary to that, we hear from superintendents that serve in really small districts that they have very small central offices. And so you have a superintendent that is a curriculum director, an HR professional, and they're spread very thin and not allowed to really specialize in what role they're particularly good at. So specializing as you get bigger at scale is particularly productive in terms of realizing efficiencies in central offices. Bill,
Chelsea,
do you want to?
Yeah, I was wondering if I could give a little bit into that. So in my work experience, I've worked in central offices for about 1,000 students up to what I currently have now of about 2,700 students here at Maple Run. And I think we have to define a little bit the central office and centralized services. I think those are 2 different things, and people usually can have conflict between what that means. I see that right here in St. Albans just this year in our budget developmental process. I can tell you that at Maple Run, we have about 4% for administrative overhead. And let me define that a little bit. We have, I call the administrative overhead our curriculum department, our human resources department, and our business department and superintendent's office. When we look at where we've been able to find efficiencies, and it looks like we're expanding central office, is in services to students and really specialized services. We have just this week launched a middle level alternative program because we were seeing for about 20 to 25 students in Maple Run across our district, a real need for alternative education that we had typically paid out to independent schools for therapy and behavioral reasons. And those usually have a price tag of about $100,000 to $125,000 per student when you combine the transportation and tuition costs. We found we've been able to do that cheaper. And I know in the past years, you've seen those presentations either from Lynn Coda and other of my colleagues who have done the same thing. Having one board to do that with really made it about a 2-meeting decision. After we presented the information to the board and we're able to say for our 3 pre-K-8s, how do we do this together? I can remember doing the same thing at Washington Central when I was there, and we were doing it for the high school. And it was easy for the high school because there was one high school. But when we started talking about this across the elementary schools with 5 boards then, it was a lot harder with the governance because it was taking the time to get everyone on board and educated about why it was. Everyone wanted best for every kid in the system. That was the baseline. But it was about the how and how do we do that and how do we do that in our communities. The district size and governance, we can really find efficiencies. And I have found that as I've moved up from 1,000 student supervisory union in Hardwick all the way to where I am now, and with having that one board. I could give you other examples of that, but those are ones right now that we're able to provide services and do those in a more economically efficient way, and then be able to individualize to student needs because we can find like students. And I did it on a special education. I could talk about the same thing for students who are interested in a technical career or have a passion for theater. I mean, I can just go on in different areas where we've been able to find efficiencies across. And that one of the other things that St. Albans has for it is our proximity. Our 3 pre-K-8s are all within a 15-minute drive of each other. But within that district, that makes it doable. And that's doable in other rural areas as well.
So what are the policy recommendations currently in terms of district size and governance? First is determine and set ideal district sizes to be included in the district quality standards that align with research. Our recommendation is that this should be set at a minimum of 2,000 to 4,000 students. The Agency of Education should work with school districts to support the movement toward the ideal district sizes over a reasonable timeline and coordinate this effort with other requirements in the DQS and education quality standards. This will require a close review of current law related to merging school districts to optimize efficiency while allowing for community input. I'll also say that there are instances in which places do want to merge but do not have the proper facilities to be able to do it, or to combine elementary schools. They just don't have enough space to absorb all the kids in the other elementary schools. So there are some real realities in terms of our infrastructure that influence these policy recommendations.
Chelsea, if you don't mind, I'm going to stop you right there. One of the things we struggle with in sort of a big, massive concept and implementing it is sort of a tearing it down and building it up, and all of the little details that go with that are frankly overwhelming. This recommendation to sort of use an existing system of DQS, which is actually relatively new. What is your understanding of sort of how that would work mechanically?
Yeah.
So let's say they make these recommendations in DQS, then what happens?
Yeah. So I think that though the DQS currently doesn't have what people would call teeth, people generally want to follow the law and will do what they can to move towards that. And what I think is important in any policy proposal moving forward is an understanding that we need to realize the actual realities on the ground of infrastructure needs, of district boundaries. Just drawing lines, as you all know, will not be effective in actually creating scale or opportunity for kids. What we learned in Act 46 too is that governance change alone is not going to necessarily result in moves towards for example, consistent quality across a supervisory union or school district, and it doesn't necessarily result in changes to the building configuration. So things need to be coupled together. And you're right, is DQS the right mechanism? I'm not positive about that, but I think it provides a place in which we currently define district efficiency and quality. And so should we be leveraging that tool, which again is currently what we have for district efficiency and quality, to move towards supporting districts and regions even in realizing some of these research-backed efficiencies of size and scale. So,
But if
yeah.
you were to kind of take this recommendation and do a deeper dive into it, we probably need to look at the teeth issue.
Yeah.
And sort of, as usual, AOE capacity to sort of take this and make it happen as well.
Yeah, and I think taking a really close look at geographic necessity again, like we have some definitions of geographic sparsity. What I hear from administrators is that there's like kind of the statistics of it all, but then there's also just the direct, how long is it on the bus? Like, and just thinking about what really is geographic necessity and what is not, and defining that more clearly would really help with some of the attempts to gain scale in the field that are already happening. Again, there's a lot of barriers to these efforts that I think people want to be able to offer and afford the same program of studies as their neighbor, but just there are some current realities that make those efficiencies harder to realize. So I know that's not a clearly defined answer, and open to further discussion about like what the correct mechanism is. We simply leaned on DQS because of the rollout around efficiency. It seems like an opportune time that if that is the framework that AOE is using to assess efficiency at the district level, then perhaps it's a tool in which we can also move towards some
No,
scale.
I really appreciate that. We've been, I think all of us, as we think about how we make things happen, struggle with like, well, is there a way we can work within the system that we currently have to make change without having to tear it apart and rebuild it? And we have really
Chelsea,
gone down.
Chelsea, can I add something?
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's a great question about the accountability, and I think one of the things that I use a lot in my work is accountability, authority, and responsibility, and all three have to go together in a system, and knowing and making that clearly defined. I think that I agree with Chelsea about the DQS as the place to start, and I think it's a great question about the accountability, and how we define that and how we put together a system that monitors that is critical. As a superintendent for a school district, I want accountability. I think it actually provides our system some structure, and I work with our board on that all the time. But in Vermont's current system, the highest place where there's accountability for myself as a superintendent is the school board. And so I think it's defining what role does the state have and what role does the agency have in that piece.
Yeah, and superintendents want change, and this doesn't necessarily represent, again, I want to reemphasize, like an end state to governance change. It's like, while we're building the ship, what are some things that can be done in an effective manner that doesn't totally implode school quality? So just really thinking about that intentionally of, again, maybe this isn't the final end all be all, but could this be a starting point that is grounded in the research that we do have currently available?
So I'm going to interrupt one second. Bill, you said accountability, authority, and what was the third?
Responsibility. I talk to my team all the time about how do you pass that down to the lowest parts of the system, so that for myself as a leader, who am I accountable to? What am I responsible for? And what do I have authority to do? And I think about that framework constantly in Maple Run. because if I take away someone's authority if I take away a principal's authority as the superintendent, then I just took on their responsibilities and then they have no accountability. But all those have to be clearly defined. Do we have it perfect? Not yet, but we seem to that seems to be the central tenets of my leadership teams. We talk about that a lot.
The second element of the recommendations is to require the reconfiguration of supervisory unions into unified school districts in response to differing district operating structures. Require that each newly formed school district designates up to 3 high schools, public or approved independent schools outside of the district, to serve as the public high school for mergers involving districts with non-operating grades. You already have a reference in statute, it's just not required. To look at legislative language there, which is in the paper. Again, school boards are largely volunteers. We're very grateful for their service. When you get to an SU structure, you're adding a lot of governance complexity. And so thinking about that as a step towards some more efficiencies in the systems and what that means for the overall long-term vision for what the delivery model looks like, we feel like is an important step.
Can I add on to that and maybe
Yeah.
have Bill comment? I worry about districts that have maintained the SU structure with multiple school boards, and all that, just in terms of attracting and retaining high-quality school leaders. I look at North Country, that has been very lucky by having 2 homegrown superintendents in a row who embrace that structure. I worry about what happens when that transition comes to a close.
Bill, your thoughts?
Yeah, I do have a thought. I think that will be harder to attract candidates. I work with an organization outside that's within New England that helps do superintendent searches. And they have told, I'm a board member for them, and they say it's a lot harder to find candidates for a district that has multiple boards than a district that has a single board. And I know that my work has gotten more focused on students by serving one board than it did multiple boards. I spent much more time serving board members.
Yeah, and a lot of those resources then get put towards instructional leadership and hopefully improvements in quality. And yeah, should we move on to school side?
Yeah.
Any other questions about district? All right, I really like this quote when it talks about the research of school size, because I think it's important. The concept of school size is somewhat nebulous. It actually represents an amalgam of effects rather than just a raw number or a single effect. Size is important because it catalyzes conditions in terms of school climate, curricular offerings, student participation in extracurricular activities, student self-concept and self-esteem, teacher-student relationships, home-school relationships, and student opportunities to learn and grow. All of these have important roles to play in determining student outcomes. And so what that quote means to me is that school size is only as important as the opportunities that it affords. And so there is some research around what that might look like, but we really have to be cognizant of, are we making recommendations for the sake of making a recommendation around school size, or can we take a closer look at what additional opportunities would be afforded at different school sizes and at a cost that is acceptable to taxpayers? So in the review of 57 studies, researchers found that the optimal students, sorry, reading off the slide is not a good idea because I couldn't see it. So I'll go back to here. There we go. In the review of 57 studies, researchers found an optimal size of 500 students for elementary schools and 1,000 for secondary schools. They advised reducing these numbers to 300 and 600 for schools with high proportions of disadvantaged students. Another study found that students learn more in middle-sized secondary schools than in smaller or larger high schools. I do want to point out that the high school conversation is, in my opinion, quite clear when talking to superintendents. The opportunities afforded in not large high schools, just kind of medium-sized high schools, not super small high schools, are really stark. The differences in the program of studies are really quite remarkable in some cases, and I've seen side by side of those comparisons. You know, the difference between multiple world languages and one or two world languages, full complementary of sports and activities and very few offerings. So I think you really do see the difference at the high school level of what those programs of studies and offerings look like. And I certainly can bring in a couple of superintendents to talk more about that if there is a need in the future. So both very small and very large schools are negatively related to school quality. Vermont's infrastructure needs are staggering. Topography and current district configurations make achieving optimal school size difficult, which I've talked about. I don't need to tell you the cost figures of the facilities needs. Again, they're very large. So even when school districts want to reconfigure, facility size and condition can limit potential outcomes.
Just a quick question, bullet two, both very small and very large schools are negatively related to school quality.
Yes.
Do we have any schools in Vermont that would fall under the definition of very large school?
No. Any thoughts before I go to policy recommendations, Bill?
Yeah, I do have a couple there, Chelsea, that I'd like to kind of add in. I think I was going to talk about the middle schools, so let me talk more about the elementary schools. When I see really small elementary schools, I have personally experienced as a parent, and I have seen other parents experience when their children may be one of very few, either by gender or by other classifications, and seeing some social outcasting. So when there's class sizes of maybe when a school is so small and it might have grade ranges of 15 to 20 kids, but there might only be 4 or 5 boys in that grade range or 4 or 5 girls in that grade range. There isn't a way to balance that out. I could say that I said that with gender. I could say the same with racial or socioeconomic status, or with any of the other historically marginalized groups. The other thing is, one of the things that we know in the classroom that happens, and when you have small schools, you tend to get the small class sizes, which we'll talk about in a minute, but is that you lose the diversity of thought in the classroom. After the teacher, one of the most powerful influences on student learning is the collaboration that happens among students. And so when you have these really small school sizes, you tend to either have to combine grade ranges or have really tiny small classes. So it affects that diversity of thought and that collaboration that happens among students. Not that it can't happen, but it's very hard on teachers. And it makes it difficult responding to special needs of individual students with smaller schools. In Vermont, we've been lucky, I think, with some of the sharing that's happened in between schools with staff. But that doesn't make it optimal, and staff, I know even in a district of our size in Maple Run, we have a few staff that are doing that and spending time during their day in cars. So that can, if we can try to get the school size to a certain size, we can, instead of having a 0.2 or 0.4 someone, we can have a 1.0 FTE and they can spend their whole time focused on kids. And so that's cool. And I've really experienced that from working, as I've said in my intro, from very tiny elementary schools of 60 up to, I service pre-K-8s right now up to 750. And we've been able to develop other programs for schools. An example is the Strings program that we've been able to put in place here in Maple Run since our merger, because of finding those efficiencies within the school buildings.
All right, policy recommendations for school size. You're going to see again that we make a recommendation to set the ideal school sizes to be included in the district quality standards. You could also choose to write it as a minimum. We think the infrastructure needs right now might prohibit the minimum set standard, but that is certainly a policy decision. And set it at 300 students for the minimum, and 600 for secondary schools as a minimum. The agency of education would then work with schools to support movement towards those ideals and should focus efforts on secondary schools first. Again, thinking about those really significant differences in programs of study. Now that I talk it out, this should probably say minimum, not ideal, because there's nothing that says that schools that are larger than that are not good models. So I would change that in the text.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to
No.
interrupt your, but just curious, in this recommendation, do you have any sense of how many schools or regions wouldn't be able to meet those minimums? And I'm thinking about the small rural elementary schools much more than the high schools, because I think with high schools, the transportation issue is much less challenging than with elementary. Have you looked at that at all?
Not in any like comprehensive way. Again, I think we really need to take a look at what is geographic necessity and what is not, before like
Okay.
really defining like necessity or not, or like geographical barriers or not. A lot of the times the sparsity research is, for example, like designed to think about weights, right? And less about how long are you on the bus, or like what are the considerations for teachers, or things like that. So I think a concentrated conversation about like how you all want to define geographic necessity is going to be crucial for that question of like, can we or can we not, in certain circumstances. Of course, like up in the Northeast Kingdom, there will be instances in which some of these conditions cannot be met without really getting into those communities and figuring out a way to help improve quality opportunities. A lot of people are working with, or not a lot, several of them up in the Northeast Kingdom look at New Hampshire and try to share services and things like that. You'll hear about in the BOCES testimony that some of the limitations is like geographical isolation. And so they're looking for like support from New Hampshire, for example. So there's certainly nuances and examples where some of these conditions maybe cannot be met, but there are definitely places where I think that they could be met and are not being met. And some of that is about infrastructure.
You're up, Leah.
One other number that I would be interested in seeing, and this might be like really premature, I admit that, but is if we were to implement these numbers right now, how many, like, could the superintendents figure out how many staff, teachers, paras, they would have to let go based on these numbers?
Maybe we could get like some anecdotal, like situation specific information about that. I think it would be very difficult on a widespread scale. I'm going to turn to Bill too, because I know a lot of superintendents, and this is not the case across the board, have really tried to use things like attrition and buyout. Like I'm asked weekly, like for information about buyout plans and things like that. And so like making it more of a voluntary thing. Again, I'm not saying that is across the board, that it's not happening, that people could potentially lose jobs through this fiscal environment and any potential future changes. But they do work very hard to use methods that look at attrition and optional buyouts. And
So-
Bill could probably add some more context.
Yeah, Chelsea, thanks. Last year, our board looked at me because we knew we had in Maple Run, we're one of two school systems in Franklin County that passed our budget on the first vote. And we narrowly passed it. And so the board directed me right away to say, hey, we know it's going to be a tough budget year this next year. We know that 80% of our budget is human resources cost. So you need to start looking at places, but we want you to use, and I've used it in my career, because in Washington Central, we lost over 200 students while I was there. So using attrition as a method for changing the number of staff we have. And we've been pretty successful with that. I'm not sure that we'll be able to keep that momentum going into this next fiscal year. And so when you think about building schools at 300 and 600, it's easy to build a spreadsheet to do that. It's not hard to do that, but it's very theoretical. And if you don't define first what you term as a quality education for your students, like that needs to be done first before you go build that spreadsheet, because that's going to tell you the programs that you want to have. And we don't, I think every locale, I know in St. Albans, we've worked hard, and we did when I was at Washington Central to say, what are the district's goals for our students? And then what's the strategic plan behind that before we went and built the staffing? We can build a staffing model, but if we don't know what we're building it towards first, it's hard to tell you how many teachers. When we get into the para-educational world, we could do some modeling off of our student needs. But then it really, I know hitting the ground, it really comes down to those individual education plans for students. And that's where the paraeducator piece comes in. And that is pretty variable in the state of Vermont from my experience. Because you're doing that as special education law requires, you're doing that at the table with a team of educators, parents, and maybe outside service providers as well. So I know can we give you some rules of thumb? Definitely. But we couldn't give you the actual, it's a theoretical exercise, if that makes sense.
And a reality in this would be, it would take so many years to get to this because of construction and some of the other things that the tool of attrition, as opposed to people actually losing their jobs, would probably be well utilized.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing here in Maple Run. We know where we'd like to be. We're not there yet. And we're trying to use attrition to change that. And it's been successful for the past 3 years.
And in general, right, we want good educators in the system. We know that nationally you're projecting even more of a workforce shortage around teachers. So I think that's all within the consideration. Does that mean that everyone would have the same exact job in certain regions? Maybe not, but I think that the opportunities will continue to be there because of the workforce shortage that we are experiencing and will continue to experience. But definitely understand that it's a very real consideration. Keep moving?
Yeah.
Okay. Class size and staffing. You know that we have come in here at the beginning of the session talking about class size, the policy as potentially being a lever early on because of some of the difficulties with accounting for staffing in general. Some of the definitions are very not clear in terms of the data collection. And so we do think that that could potentially be a good policy lever, but would need to get very clear on how we're defining staffing and like what it means to have ideal staffing levels in different categories for the type of education system that we are hoping to achieve. Class size is pivotal in Vermont's education policy decisions. And comes with also all the same rural considerations that we've been talking about. Vermont class sizes are already smaller than those outlined in research, and that research shows mixed results regarding the relationship between class size and student outcomes. So in general, the research has been showing that it's not necessarily the best bang for your buck around class sizes. And when they're looking at this research, they're talking typically about situations in which they're going from about 30 students down to 20 to 17 to 20. So it's not necessarily super relevant to the Vermont context. In Vermont, class sizes can fall significantly below the range of research. Like I said, very small class sizes can create challenges for instruction. They can force grade configurations like multi-age classroom for grades K through 3 that change yearly, creating an inconsistent curricular experience and making it difficult for teachers to implement varied instructional practices like ability mixed and ability alike groupings, cooperative learning in very small classes. These are our instructional practices that are very well defined in research, but not often referenced in terms of class size research. Currently Vermont's policy is silent on minimum class sizes and caseloads. I included the reference to the EQS that talks about minimums. I won't read it. And in addition, Act 153 of 2010 required that each supervisory union and member district board adopt a minimum and optimal average class size policies. We viewed a representative sample, and by that I mean geographically representative, of these current district policies, and minimums range from 10 to 15 for K through 3, 10 to 18 for 4 through 8, and 10 to 23 for 9 through 12. Please note, these are average class size policies, so it does allow for some flexibility if you have, for example, one small class for a particular subject and then not for another, or related to different grade bands as well.
You query your folks as to whether anybody actually followed their class size policies as required?
It's not good practice for my position to call out superintendents, but maybe
Well,
Bill.
it's a school board issue. It's a school
It
board
truly
policy
is.
that's supposed to be followed.
Yeah,
Speaking as a former school board chair, it's not,
yeah.
it is not a policy we revert back to as much as we should have.
And I will not name names in this situation, but sometimes they're not updated frequently, or like you said, they're not adhered to when the time comes to vote on budgets at the school board level. Bill, anything to add there?
Yeah, I have a few things to add there. I was kind of chuckling in the background. This year, my board chair and I, we determined we have a class size policy that doesn't have any numbers in it. It just says the superintendent and the school board shall determine the class size, optimal class sizes for Maple Run. And because I knew where we were budgetarily, I thought it was we both decided this was a good thing for the board to struggle with and to look at. And so we talked about it, and we gave all the class size data for probably the past 3 years in Maple Run to the board. And we have some class sizes that range from what I would call the low teens and that 13, 14 area to up to over 20 in our pre-K through 8 classrooms. And in our high school, we even have greater range from 10 to a doubly instructed or team taught phys ed course that can be around 50 students. We average 17 at the high school, and we average 15 or 16 in our pre-K through 8th grades across our 3 schools. It was very difficult for our board to make the decision. They want to be supportive of students and teachers, but they also feel pressure from parents and teachers to keep class sizes small. And that was a difficult decision for them to wrestle with. We finally did and set our minimums at 15 for pre-K through 3, 18 for 4 through 12. And just set that this past fall. I asked them to do that before we went into budgetary development, so that we had guidelines as administration of how they wanted us to construct it. Also allowing for very small classes if needed for specialized instruction, whether that was tier 2 or tier 3 supports. I've seen this in very small schools. It's very difficult because when you talk about class size, boards they usually don't talk about class size during budgeting. They're talking about the number of teachers, but everyone knows it's talking about class size. And at that same time, they're wrestling with, do I have a teacher teach 2, 3, or 4 grade levels, or have a very small class size? And what happens to that quality? I love that quote you had, Chelsea, about, there's multiple factors that go into student success. And so that quality of the teachers is a really important one. And we know that teachers, just for 1 grade level, need to know plus or minus 2 grade levels of instruction and curriculum for the grade level of which they're teaching. So that means if you're a 4th grade teacher, you need to know from 2nd grade to 6th grade. So if you start teaching multi-grade and you have more than 2 grades in a classroom, it really starts to expand the repertoire of what the teacher needs to know. And that's a huge load to put on our teachers. I will tell you that one of the things that we have found across our buildings in our K3, we had ranges from 13 to 25 in grade levels. We implemented a new literacy program 3 years ago. And the first year of implementing that, the teachers that implemented it to fidelity well outperformed their colleagues, and they had class sizes in the 20 versus the low to mid-teens. So it wasn't necessarily about the class size, it was about the quality of instruction that was happening in the classroom.
Have there been any significant time studies that have been carried out among faculty to compare the amount of time they're putting into multi-age classroom, multi-grade classrooms versus single grade classrooms, or different class sizes when they reach those levels of success?
Can I get back to you?
Sure.
I don't know any off the top of my head, but that doesn't mean they don't exist.
All right.
Bill, do you know?
I don't know of any either. I know that we've looked a lot at either 2 grade bands or 1 grade band, or one of the things the only thing I can comment is towards looping, but that means being consistently with a group of children for 2 years, not about the grade ranges in that.
Mm-hmm.
And the looping shows that's, especially in the second year of a 2-year loop, that provides more time on instruction because you have that relationship with that group of kids.
We want to emphasize that the focus on class size in this section should not imply that policy should disproportionately impact one category of employee over another. We do think staff to student ratio should be looked at, and we do feel like central office and administration should be looked at through the process of the district size, because oftentimes that's a function of whatever you determine from policy around district size. So do not want it to seem like we only think that class size is the important mechanism and that we're disproportionately trying to impact one employee over another. That's not the case. Again, district, we are hoping that the conversation around administration is focused on in the district level or the district policy decisions, and that we are conscientious of making sure that we're getting very clear on definitions of what staffing means in the state of Vermont, so that we can get good data and reporting on that. Again, I gave the example last time of sometimes contractors, for example, are counted differently in one district compared to the other. And so just getting really clear and consistent about that can help with policy decisions in the second half of the biennium around staff to student ratios. We are significantly lower ratio than other New England counterparts. We do understand that. And then just one last thing, because you all will inevitably be thinking about foundation formula. So in the PICUS report, they aim to address specific staffing rules in relation to setting an adequate amount of funding. It does not specifically look at what would be required for Vermont to implement its vision for education. For example, the description of a Vermont education currently defined in the revised EQS education quality standards. What's more, it does not always align with initiatives already set in law. For example, it does not model multi-tiered systems of support effectively in the way that Vermont has asked school districts to implement, which is good practice. Thus, while the PICUS report can serve as a starting point for policy discussions, there are distinct adjustments that need to be made to align with current values supported in policy and a future vision for public education in Vermont. Policymakers should be cautious of adopting and implementing a foundation formula with an adequacy allotment based on staffing rules that don't align with the current reality or future vision for what you all hope to see in Vermont public education school system. So the policy recommendations related to class size, we actually got in a room with about 40 of the 56 superintendents and said, hash it out. What do you think that looks like? Because again, the research isn't really applicable to Vermont. We are talking about ranges of class sizes that are focused on much bigger scale in other communities based in research. And so when they got together, they had 5 groups, and then I just tried to kind of combine and average what they came up with. But there was generally some common themes. They feel that kindergarten should stay relatively small at about 12. and then 1 to 5 around 15, 6 to 12 around 18. And again, those are minimums, not maximums. And some exceptions may need to be made for things like CTE courses. We believe that the delivery mechanism are already there. You can include it in the EQS and in the school board policy. Additionally, as I've mentioned, requiring the AOE to clearly define staffing reporting so that you all can think about that and talk about that in the next biennium. That was a lot. Thank you for giving us time. We feel that careful considerations must be made to balance both gains in efficiency and quality. The findings in this brief indicate that reforms that far exceed research-backed recommendations for scale, particularly district scale, are ill-advised in categories for both efficiency and quality until we fully understand their consequences. Comprehensive reform will marry thoughtful sequencing of change to governance, education delivery, and funding. Please do not change the funding mechanism without changing some of the other delivery mechanisms, because doing the same with less is really not an option for our kids in Vermont. So thank you for being bold and talking about this. And we look forward to further conversations.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
This is really a lot of food for thought, and clearly a lot of work went into it. I really appreciate that. All right, right on time. Oh, Bill, anything else that you wanted to say?
No, I just thank the education committee for inviting me to attend with Chelsea, and I think that's it.
Great, thank you. Let's take 5 minutes while we reset the